Today we're talking about the gateway process. It's a 28-page document written in 1983 by a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel named Wayne McDonnell, stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, which, if you don't know, is the same base as the NSA headquarters. He was tasked by his commanding officer to assess a consciousness training program developed by a private institute in rural Virginia. What he handed back was a quantum physics argument for astral projection, out-of-body travel, and time perception, as well as entity contact. It was stamped classified, the Army buried it for 20 years, it was declassified in 2003 and then sat completely unread in a CIA reading room for another 18 years until someone posted it on Reddit in 2021 and it went viral. What I want to do is just walk through what the document actually says, because most people encounter it through a Reddit summary and never actually read it, and what it actually says is more interesting than a summary. The argument is this: consciousness doesn't emerge from matter, matter emerges from consciousness. That's the through line of the entire document. Everything McDonnell writes is building toward that one claim, and he's not making it as some mystic or philosopher. He's making it as a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel submitting a formal assessment to his commanding officer. So let's start at the beginning. In the 1950s, a businessman named Robert Monroe started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences. Not a religious figure, not a guru, a businessman. He spent the rest of his life studying what was happening to him and eventually founded the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, which is still operating today. What Monroe developed is a technology called hemisync. The mechanism is the frequency-following response. Two slightly different audio frequencies delivered to each ear through stereo headphones. The brain perceives the difference between them as a third tone and tries to match it, involuntarily. The goal is to synchronize the left and the right hemispheres of the brain and progressively raise brainwave frequency until consciousness shifts into altered states. McDonnell describes this as a difference between a lamp and a laser. Normal human consciousness is a lamp, diffuse, scattered, energy going in every direction at once with limited depth or penetration. Hemisync turns it into a laser, coherent, focused, all the energy moving in the same direction at the same frequency. The Army wanted to know if it worked and whether it had military applications, so they sent McDonnell to attend the training himself and write up what he found. The first thing that McDonnell says in the opening memo is his primary objective was to bring out-of-body states into language of physical science, to remove, in his words, the stigma of their occult connotations, which is a strange thing to lead with in a military assessment document. He's not just evaluating a program, he's performing a translation, taking something that lives in a mystical register and moving it somewhere the military can work with it. He quotes Niels Bohr up front to preempt the objection. Bohr once told his son, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical." McDonnell is acknowledging that grasping what he's about to describe requires something beyond pure linear reasoning, but he's confident the framework holds up to rational scrutiny once you make that shift. And there's a general anxiety that he seems to be confronting, that any explanation that sits outside our normal understanding of physics produces a specific kind of resistance, a friction that activates before the content can even be assessed. McDonnell feels that pressure enough that he spends the bulk of the opening building credibility before he'll say anything that might trigger it. He also notes, and this is strange for a classified document, that he felt it necessary to ensure his conclusions do not do any violence to fundamental, mainstream, or either Eastern or Western belief systems. A classified memo doesn't need to be ecumenically sensitive, unless it was always intended to be read by more than one commanding officer. We'll come back to that. To understand what the gateway is actually doing, you need to understand something about how the brain handles information. The left hemisphere is the gatekeeper. It screens everything coming in, categorizes it, assigns meaning, and decides what gets passed through to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere accepts whatever the left passes to it without question. Hypnosis works by suppressing that gatekeeper. Suggestions go straight through to the right hemisphere, which then produce real physiological responses to things that aren't physically present. Suggest numbness in a limb and the body produces numbness. Suggest euphoria and the pleasure centers activate. The body cannot tell the difference between a real stimulus arriving through the senses and a suggestion that bypasses the filter. both end up hitting the same physical map in the brain, a region called the homunculus, where specific cortical points correspond to specific body parts, and both produce the same output. The most conservative demonstration of this document is the biofeedback experiment involving a thermometer. A subject concentrates on increasing their circulation in their left leg while monitoring a digital thermometer attached to it. When the concentration starts working, the thermometer registers an actual measurable temperature increase, concentrated in tension directly altering a physical parameter in the body. McDonnell is building a credibility ladder deliberately. Thermometer first, time travel later. By the time you get to the advanced states, he's already shown you that consciousness has measurable physical effects and you've accepted it without noticing you've accepted it. Now here's where it connects to something older. Kundalini meditation, one of the oldest contemplative practices in existence, produces acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles through years of sustained practice. Hemisync produces standing wave patterns through binaural beats through headphones in an afternoon. Different delivery mechanisms, same fundamental tool. Modulated standing waves bypassing the left brain's filtering function. The left brain gatekeeper has a specific acoustic vulnerability. You don't convince it to stand down, you vibrate it into a different state. And the document explicitly connects this to the Schumann resonance. The Earth's ionosphere cavity resonates at approximately 7 to 7.5 Hz. In deep meditative states, the heart bifurcation echo, a real documented cardiovascular phenomenon, fades as the body relaxes, produces a clean sine wave resonance through the body at the same frequency. Bentov, the biomedical engineer McDonnell draws on throughout the document, calls this the ideal medium for conveying a telepathic signal. And this is kind of where the document stops being a military assessment and becomes something else entirely. McDonnell states plainly, solid matter in a strict construction of the term simply does not exist. Atomic structure is composed of oscillating energy grids surrounded by oscillating energy grids. The so-called states of matter are variances in the state of energy. This is consistent with what quantum physics actually says. The electron cloud model replaced the solid particle model decades ago. The implications of that just haven't filtered into how most people think about reality. If matter is oscillating energy, then consciousness, also an energy system, isn't categorically different than the physical world it perceives. McDonnell draws on Karl Pibram at Stanford and David Bohm in London to argue that the universe is a hologram and human consciousness is also a hologram. The hologram model sounds abstract, but the implication is specific. When two coherent light sources interact, they create an interference pattern where information is distributed throughout the entire medium, not stored in one place. Every fragment of the hologram contains the whole image. Bentov uses 3 pebbles dropped into water as an example. The ripple pattern flash frozen. The ice illuminated with a laser. What results is a 3-dimensional reconstruction of the stone suspended in mid-air. If you only had the ripple pattern, you would essentially have the stones. The pattern encodes their position with such fidelity that the pattern is the stones informationally speaking. When you map that onto consciousness, the double-slit experiment clicks into place. Consciousness is the pebbles in motion. The universe is the water at rest. The interference pattern between them is reality as we experience it. Consciousness isn't witnessing the hologram. Consciousness is one of the 2 required elements for the hologram to exist at all. Which means you never perceive reality directly. You perceive the difference between reality and your model of reality. The model is always the filter, and the quality of that filter determines the quality of the reality you construct. McDonnell identifies self-cognition as what differentiates human consciousness from everything else. Not just knowing, but knowing that you know. Consciousness watching itself think. At elevated frequency states, the mind stops outputting in language and starts outputting in symbols, which is why every mystical tradition that developed a method for accessing non-ordinary states also developed a symbolic vocabulary for what came back. The mystics weren't being obscure. That's the format of the transmission at those frequencies. McDonnell defines time not as a dimension we move through, but as a measurement of energy in motion. Space not as a container, but as a condition produced when energy is confined within a vibratory pattern. Time and space are fundamentally features of reality. They are emergent properties of energy behaving in a particular way. Energy that isn't confined into oscillating patterns exists outside both time and space simultaneously. McDonnell calls this the absolute, infinite conscious energy, occupying every dimension simultaneously, including ours, but imperceptible to ordinary consciousness. He maps it directly onto the Judeo-Christian father later in the document. Finds the same structure in Eastern traditions. Every tradition arrives at identical architecture with different vocabulary. He uses the word absolute because classified military memos need neutral language. He's not exactly being subtle about what he means. Between our dimension and the absolute are intervening dimensions, not locations, frequency states at different energy gradients. The mechanism for entering them is called Planck's distance. Every oscillating wave, including brainwaves, has 2 points of complete rest at the boundary of each oscillation. At those points, the energy briefly exits time-space entirely, clicks out as he calls it. This is already happening in your brain between every thought, every moment of consciousness. You are already clicking in and out of these intervening dimensions continuously. Gateway doesn't create a new capability, it accelerates the brainwave frequency until the clickouts approach continuity. The gaps become the dominant state. Now here's the part of the document that doesn't get discussed. In the official recommendations section, the part where McDonnell tells the Army about how to operationalize all of this, Point J states that personnel should be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. Point K recommends using groups of people in altered states to build holographic patterns around sensitive areas to repulse possible unwanted out-of-body presences. The Army is recommending psychic defense parameters in an official military document as a practical operational consideration, almost as an aside, like it's the least surprising thing in the document. And then there's the missing pages. The document jumps from what should be page 25 to what appears to be page 37, roughly 12 pages missing from the middle. The popular version of this narrative claims that missing pages contained practical instructions for achieving out-of-body states. The one page that tells you how to do it is the one that essentially got redacted. But reading the full document, that doesn't hold up. The practical out-of-body instructions are present later. They're not missing. The more likely content based on the document's structure is the full theological synthesis, the part where McDonnell formally argues the physics confirms the existence of God and maps it across every major religious tradition simultaneously. The practical consciousness technology was fine to release, the part where a lieutenant colonel at Fort Meade submits a formal argument that the universe is conscious and that every mystical tradition in human history was describing the same underlying physics, that stayed classified. Whether this document was deliberately seeded into the information environment or found its audience through organic dissemination is another question. It sat publicly available and essentially unread for 18 years. Then one Reddit post and it's everywhere simultaneously. That's not how important information normally propagates. But in a holographic universe where past, present, and future coexist simultaneously in an interference pattern, the distinction between intentional and accidental may not be as meaningful as it appears. The document was always going to end up where it ended up. You cannot read this document clean. The source contaminates it permanently. Army intelligence, Fort Meade, NSA headquarters right next door. A classified program to train soldiers to leave their bodies and access other dimensions. A formal recommendation to prepare for entity contact. 12 missing pages and then silence. No follow-up documents in the public record. No official account of what experiments produced. No record of what they found when they got there. The document describes its own obstacle in the reader. Near the end, McDonnell describes what happens as brainwave frequency accelerates toward continuity in the click-out state. He reaches for a metaphor, and the one he chooses is human consciousness passes through the looking glass of time-space after the fashion of Alice beginning her journey into Wonderland. The looking glass is more precise than it first appears. Alice doesn't go through a door or a portal. She passes through a mirror. A surface that looks like it's showing you reality, but is showing you a reversed image of it. The moment she's through, normal rules of logic, causality, and physical law stop applying. Things mean they're opposites. Size is arbitrary, time runs sideways. But that framing implies something about this side of the glass that McDonnell doesn't quite say directly. McDonnell closes with a quote from psychologist Keith Floyd that he seems to have included almost as an afterthought. One line, no elaboration. Contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. Make of that what you will. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Deuces.